there again. This is Lynette.
And this is Renee.
And this is Bruce.
And this is Bruce. We are from Christian Roots Canada, and our mission is to help you see Canadian history with new eyes.
Yes, many Christians know very little about how Canada began, but we believe Canada as a nation had its nucleus in Daniel chapter 2.
So here to help us tell that story is Bruce Gore. And if you had watched the last session, you would have heard the sweep of history from Nebuchadnezzar's dream to the coming of Christ. So here is Bruce to tell us a little bit more about that. Give us another 500 years of history in half an hour.
Sure. Well, nice to be back, and welcome to all who are following along this series that we're doing. Last time we were trying to give a little bit of an overview of what took place between the time of Daniel's vision, which is in very rough round numbers, around 500 BC up to the time of Christ. Of course, everything changes with Christ, and the vision of Daniel chapter 2 really reflects that, as we find the vision of great Gentile powers being swept away, and instead a great kingdom established. The Old Testament had repeatedly looked forward to a time when God was going to establish his kingdom. The Old Testament will often say that he was going to establish a kingdom and put the descendant of David, a new David, on the throne who would rule, and that would be the characteristic of this new era. And of course, from a New Testament point of view, Jesus is often called the Son of David. He was a direct descendant of David. But more than that, he was the Son of God. He was God incarnate among us. So he came both as the human descendant of David, the Lion of the tribe of Judah, he's calls in Revelation, but he also came as the very God of all eternity. The Logos, who was God, becomes one of us, and that great human being, mysterious to say the least, two natures, one person, was there, and all history has been affected by it. It's no accident that universally around the world, when we tell each other what year it is, if I tell you it's the year 2021 right now, well, 2021 from what? From the time of Christ. He's the one that changed everything. And even people that want to substitute CE, let's say, for AD, Anno Domini, the year of our Lord, they want to say, well, let's make it the common era, CE. Well, what made it the common era? It was Christ. He was the one who changed everything, established a kingdom, so that now the transcendent reality of human history is this that Christ put in place. And it's been a gradual process. No one ever said this was going to take place overnight. It has been God's design and good purpose that this process should take place slowly, gradually, that the growth would be something that would not take place typically in a spectacular or dramatic way, but that it would take place in a way that was almost imperceptible. Jesus likens the growth of a kingdom to a mustard seed. In the ancient world, the mustard seed was commonly viewed as the smallest of seeds. I've held a couple of mustard seeds in my hand, and they're just tiny little black dots. You can hardly see them. But you put them in the ground and give it some time, and that seed can grow to be a huge, huge bush or a tree even that is almost as dramatic in its size as is the mustard seed dramatic in its smallness. So anyway, that's the story that gets going. Christ is, of course, crucified. He rises the third day. He commissions his disciples. He tells them to go into the world and make disciples of the nations. It's a tall order for, guys that a few days earlier were just fishermen, we call them blue collar workers, but nevertheless, that's the commission Jesus gave them. And they set about the task. And at the beginning, it was a pretty bumpy road. I think most people are aware that in the early days, the most ferocious persecution of Christian people, the greatest resistance that Christian people met was from the Jewish nation itself. All you have to do is read the New Testament. Virtually any book of the New Testament will document the hostility that the Jewish nation, unbelieving Israel, had against the growth of the Christian movement. Obviously, the first Christians were Jewish, but there was a minority. Most were opposed to the Christian faith, especially the leadership. But something dramatic happened in the first century. When the year 70 AD rolls around, there was a great reversal. At the trial of Jesus, the Jewish brass who were there wanting Jesus crucified cried out in Pilate's hearing, "We have no king but Caesar." That was an official and explicit repudiation of the rule of Christ. It was a repudiation of the rule of God. It was a repudiation of their own history, their own Torah, their own background. It was a complete commitment to a pagan authority to rule over them. And that, of course, was a remarkable turning point. Not every Jewish person would have signed off on that, but you might say, speaking for official Israel, that was a great turning point. And as Jesus repeatedly predicted, judgment would come. Judgment would come on this unbelieving nation. And in 70 AD, the Jewish nation was liquidated. The Romans came in, they besieged Jerusalem, it fell, the temple was destroyed, the city was destroyed, basically wiped off the map for a period of time. And at that point, you see, something new and different has happened. Up until then, Christian people had been more or less tethered to the temple, to the city of Jerusalem. But as the event was approaching, Christian people obeying Christ, who said, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, get out of town, they got out of town. And they survived this great cataclysm. And then the Christian movement, no longer having a temple, no longer having Jerusalem, became, in a sense, a new and independent movement standing on its own 2 feet, a new Jerusalem, a new temple, a new priesthood based on a new sacrifice, a new land, which was the whole world. And from that time on, we have a very different kind of story going on. Well, the Christian movement continued to grow. From the year 70 to 100, it was fairly quiet. The next persecution of Christians really came at the end of the first century under an emperor named Domitian. Didn't last long. It was fairly abbreviated, only a few months. It was vicious, but not protracted. And then again, the Christian faith was able to enjoy some time of peace and quiet. In other words, the Roman persecution of Christians was sporadic. Many times people don't appreciate that. They think it was a constant, nonstop barrage of hostility from the Roman people against the Christian people. But that's really not the case. Persecutions took place here and there, sometimes more consolidated than at other times. The next persecution that really was of note was under Trajan, around the year 120 AD. And again, it was serious, but it didn't last for all that long. An emperor named Antoninus Pius, about the middle of the 2nd century, launched a persecution. But the point is, here and there would be these hostile reactions to Christians. But in the meantime, the Christian movement was growing. And in fact, it was insinuating itself. Go right ahead. Go ahead, Lynette. I see you.
So again, I'm thinking in terms, as you're speaking, I'm thinking about the parallels in the history that I'm teaching.
Yeah.
Right? So Roman persecution based on, and I know that I heard this before when I audited some the classes in seminary when Tim was there.
Mm-hmm.
So yes, it was sporadic. But when I compare that to the persecution of the French Protestants,
Mm-hmm.
it seemed like it was just really long and
Mm-hmm.
ongoing year after year after year after year. So
Mm-hmm.
that was different from the Roman persecution?
Well, it was, in a sense, that the French persecution of the Huguenots was protracted, but even then there was a kind of sporadic aspect to it. You think of the St. Bartholomew Day massacre. That was sort of a culminating moment that was an explosion, you might say, of persecution. Things had been difficult from time to time up until then, and certainly continued to be after that. But even then, there had been, in, you know, this history better than I do, I think that even in France, there had been at one point a ruler who was fairly sympathetic to the Protestant Reformation and so on. But political forces finally took over, and so you're quite correct in that. Yeah.
Yeah, because when I think about the length of the constant persecution,
yes,
like I never made the connection that the Roman persecution, almost like the extremity of it might have been different, but the scope of the persecution was, in France, it was surely, I have to think about that some. It was surely more ongoing during the time, because from what I've researched, under Francis, it was sporadic, but under his son, Henry II, it was horrible. It went on year after year after year, and he brought more and more stringent measures. And then, so the only person who was kind of really sensitive to the Protestant cause was one of Henry's son, and he was Henry II. You know, so he gave them a little bit of a hiatus, but then things exploded when they realized that Henry of Navarre was going to be on the throne, and that is what they didn't want happening. But even after Henry, like Louis XIV, I haven't gotten there yet, but Louis XIV, he was just plain horrible. He was, to me, he was worse than the Romans.
It's very true, and that is what part of the unhappy story of the growth of the church. And actually, the Huguenots, in many ways, became some of the most influential Christians of all time, just because they were hardened, you might say, by the experiences that they had gone through over the years. It's very good.
Interesting.
So in the Roman era, you might say that first 500 years, from the time of Christ to about the year 500, you could divide it roughly down the middle, not quite evenly, but of course the Christian faith was made legal in 313, empire-wide, about 10 years later, when Constantine became the emperor of the entire Roman world. It had been divided between East and West. And in many ways, the worst persecution of Christians was in the 2nd century. By the 3rd century, the 200s, it was less so. There were still persecutions, but not quite as widespread. And the last great one was an emperor named Diocletian, who was ruling toward the end of the 200s. And it was vicious. It was a rough time. But in some way, and he was a quite competent emperor. In fact, oddly enough, it was the best emperors of Rome who were the most vicious persecutors of Christians. They kind of understood the threat, you know. The more self-indulgent, narcissistic rulers didn't really care much, but it was the good ones that had it in for the Christians. But as it turns out, Constantine became an heir to the throne through a complicated series of events and family tree and so on. And what exactly was in his mind remains an open question. Some people are great celebrators of Constantine. Some people are very critical of him. I kind of like the guy, you know. I think he was a good thing in the history of the church. But at the same time, he certainly wasn't perfect, and he was responsible for some fairly brutal acts in war as well. So you just have to take these guys as you find them, but appreciate that he did, in fact, finally issue the Edict of Toleration, as it was called, which officially recognized the fact that if a person was going to be a Christian in the Roman world, they would not be persecuted for it at all. Eventually, Constantine went beyond that and actually gave rather lavish awards to people for becoming Christians. Now, that's not a good evangelistic technique, you see, but he actually would promise various kinds of benefits, financial and otherwise, for people who would convert. Problem with that is you get a lot of converts, but sometimes not a lot of genuine faith, you know. Constantine, I think, in a very touching moment when he convened the Council of Nicaea, had there in his audience people who had been persecuted severely under Diocletian, and he actually gave special recognition to them. It was quite an astonishing moment when the Emperor of Rome, Rome that had been such an enemy of God's people, the Emperor of Rome now in effect bows the knee to Christian people and acknowledges the important role that they had played. And that's quite a remarkable turning point. And to think that it took place, relatively speaking, not that long after the time of Christ, a couple of 100 years, you know, historically speaking, not that long, is rather remarkable. Well, the story of the church, of course, takes on a somewhat different color once it's legal, because now Christians are not being persecuted. In fact, there is a kind of preferential treatment that's being given to Christians. And while we may appreciate that and sort of like it, it doesn't really work well for the general health of the church to be given preferential treatment, you see, because then people tend to align themselves with the Christian movement for the wrong reasons, and it dilutes the sort of deep poignancy of what true faith is. And I think we see that over the next 100 years or so. We see that the Christian faith not losing its way, but certainly losing its edge a little bit. And there tends to be something more of a kind of an easy sort of spirit that's associated with the Christian movement that hadn't been the case in earlier days. Obviously, all through this period, there are monumental intellects who are reflecting the story of the Christian movement, defending it against its enemies. Justin Martyr in the middle of the 2nd century, Irenaeus toward the end of the 2nd century, Origen, Clement of Alexandria, and so on. These are all important voices. Tertullian and others played a very important role, contributed heavily to the writings of the time, and much of what we know about the church in those days is connected to these who were very important voices defending the Christian movement. The greatest of them was Augustine, who died in 430. He's born about 350 after the Council of Nicaea, considered the greatest of the church fathers, the first of the great medieval theologians. And he is the one who really, in many ways, pulls together a vision of what God is doing in history. This is kind of important because last time when we were talking about Daniel chapter 2 and the rock that blew the great image away, we were noticing that the promise of Daniel 2 was that this kingdom would grow, and it would continue to become a more dominant influence in the world. Augustine is the first great thinker in church history to really work that out in a way that became quite influential for subsequent history. A lot of the time up until then, the church was being harried from pillar to post, dodging bullets, just trying to survive and doing pretty well at it. But the thought of the Christian movement becoming a dominant worldwide presence was not the first thing that people thought of when they thought of what it meant to be a Christian. But by the time Augustine is around, he can write this great book, a classic, The City of God is the name of it. And he does spell it out. He says, in this world, there's the city of God and the city of man. And the city of God gradually, over time, becomes increasingly dominant and important. Athanasius, who went a little before Augustine, writes a book called On the Resurrection, and he also makes a similar kind of case for the gradual movement and growth of the Christian faith. And so we have a vision that really comes into focus there. And in some ways, you would say that inspired the first great missionary effort So by the time we reach the end of that first 500 years, you have Christian people, largely monks, who are prepared to risk their lives to take the Christian message to the world. And that was, for someone that was going to do that, it was tough to get life insurance. They were going to go out and put themselves at risk of life and limb. And many of them paid for their courage with their lives, because they were going to largely uncivilized, barbarian regions where oftentimes the tribal groups were, to say the least, hostile and oftentimes violent. But these monks, and many of them, hundreds of them, went out. They built little sort of facilities that eventually became monasteries. They offered medical care. They offered food. They offered clothing. They offered education. They became the best example, you might say, of the cutting edge of Christ's work in this world. And in many ways, the whole Western history has owed a great debt to the work of these who were just at the end of that first 500 years or so. But let's say from about the year 450 on, Rome, the political Rome collapsed in 476 in the West. And the next really phase, you might say, of Christian history is what I like to call the story of a Holy Mother Church. That's usually considered a Catholic expression, but I own it. Even though I'm a Protestant, I think it was a time when the Christian movement was going out and trying to provide something of not just the message of the gospel, which was always the most important thing, but the message of help and hope, education, care for those who were sick or needy. In other words, mixing a message of redemption with actions of salvation and so on. And the Christian movement became virtually synonymous with a mother caring for some very needy children. And that gave the church great credibility. By the end of that first 500 years, the church is well on her way to being almost universally admired for the good work that she was doing in Europe and eventually to other parts of the world as well. So it's kind of a rocky beginning, but that's the general impulse. Go ahead.
Okay, so like I said, we're talking and my wheels are turning here.
Oh, good. I'm glad to hear that.
Because some things that I've heard before, hearing you explain, how the development of the theology based on Augustine, and the fact that the monks became the first missionaries.
Yes.
And they represented Christ's hands and feet, the serving church.
Yes.
And that was then before one would think about the monastery as associated only with the current Catholic Church.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And I think a lot of Christians don't know that, because when you hear monastery and monks, you automatically think about the current Catholic Church.
Right. Or the Catholic Church at the time of the Reformation,
Yes.
which was 1,000 years later, and a lot happened in that 1,000 years. And so I'm talking about the early stages, and these were genuine people of deep faith and courage who knew that they were likely eventually to pay for their labors with their lives, and they did it nevertheless. But the next 500 years that we talk about, say from 500 to 1,000, things change. Okay. And we begin to see Holy Mother Church becoming political church. You see, the power kind of goes to her head. So by the time we get to the year 1000, you've got things like the Crusades happening. In other words, the church looks a lot different. Okay. But I'm talking about that very early impulse to go out and provide good, healthy, hearty help. Go ahead.
So here's my question. How does that compare with what I've read about with the Jesuits? Because my understanding is that they attempted to use service to the communities.
Yes.
Particularly the communities that were Protestant.
Yes, that's exactly right.
They used that to spread their influence, but it was more a political thing compared to the monks in the monastery in the earlier.
Yeah, very much so. Yeah. The Jesuits did a lot of good. I'm no great fan of the Jesuits historically, but they were formulated. They were part of what's called the Counter-Reformation. St. Ignatius Loyola was the guy who came up with the idea. I like to think of the Jesuits as something like the Catholic Special Ops. They were the people who had an immense amount of training, and their stated purpose was to win back Protestant nations.
Yes.
And so in England and elsewhere, they came in under the radar. In many cases, they came in very much incognito, but their training was to try to undermine and sabotage, especially the political order in Protestant nations, and in any way they could, legitimate or illegitimate, try to bring those nations back into the Catholic fold. And in some ways, they were fairly successful at that.
Yeah, they were in some places. True. But I like that terminology, and I'm going to borrow that from you, the Catholic Special Ops.
That's exactly what they were. Yes, indeed.
Yeah, because I'm reading about how Cardinal Richelieu,
yes,
he has been the one character that I find it hard to tell the story as easily as I did with the others. Yeah. Like he's totally different from Francis and from every other person that I dealt with, because he was the main instrument in France to undo the Protestants. And he has been just a horrible creature.
Yeah,
and he used the Jesuits to do the job.
Yes, indeed.
Them.
Yeah.
So this is all fascinating for me to see that link and to tease out the difference between the monks of St. Augustine's time and the monks of during the Reformation.
Yes, and there was a kind of evolution over time of what the monks look like. You see, so the original monks, inspired by Augustine, went out, I think, pretty much with pure hearts. We have a tendency to look back through the lens of what the monks later became and judge them all accordingly. And that's kind of unfair to those original Christians who in many cases were very deep, committed Christian people trying to do the right thing. So that's an important distinction to make.
Renee wanted to ask something.
Okay, good. Renee.
Yes, that statement a little while back now, towards the beginning, but I just had to ponder it for a bit when you mentioned that the Pharisees at the time of Jesus' death said that we have no other king but Caesar, and kind of the line that drew and how that changed everything. I just thought about how at the beginning, in the time of Samuel, when they asked for a king, now they say they have no other king but Caesar. Just how the progression in a downward fashion happened. Yeah. And I just wondered what that says to us, even as believers now, when we start to take, the king or the government in a role that it was not meant to have.
Yeah. Oh, that is such a wonderful question. And I wish I had about an hour to work on that with you. But there, the model that comes out of the Reformation, and especially John Calvin in Geneva, and then into Scotland, John Knox, of course, implemented it there, and Canada and the United States, is that government fundamentally has the purpose of restraining evil. We are fractured people, and we have a tendency to hurt each other unless somebody restrains us. We have a deep, selfish impulse to do bad things. And so government is there. You might say almost like a necessary evil. James Madison said, if men were angels, we wouldn't need government, and it's really true. But men are not angels, so we do need government. But it is not the task of government to inspire great good works. It just doesn't work that way. And that's the danger. We think if we just elect the right president or the right prime minister, or we get the right people into judicial positions or this or that, we'll solve all our problems. And of course, never happens that way, because these are not the functions of those political operatives. It's not their role. We have to look somewhere else. We have to look to the church. We have to look to courageous preachers. We have to look to a redemptive influence in culture to bring about great good, while looking to government to restrain great harm. And when we confuse those roles, then we tend to be disappointed, because government can never deliver this wonderful culture. It can never create utopia. And when it tries to, it's always a bloodbath.
Okay, I wanted to go back to something else that you mentioned. Again, like when you're speaking, I'm putting myself into the stories I've written about France.
Mm-hmm.
So the Edict of Toleration,
Mm-hmm.
that was the first time was Constantine.
Yes, right.
And what did that edict say?
This was in I want to say 313. I think it was very early. He hadn't even taken over the whole empire yet, but he had won at the Melvian Bridge and became the Western ruler. And one of the first things he did was the Edict of Toleration, which really was not giving any special privileges to Christians, but simply indicating that Christians are no longer going to be persecuted, that they are not going to be treated to the kind of harsh experience they'd had up until that point. That was a great thing for Christians. I mean, they were celebrating in the streets just for that. It was some years later that Constantine actually was upping the ante and actually beginning to give even more lavish reinforcements to people for becoming Christian. But the Edict of Toleration was that original ban on harsh treatment, persecution of Christians.
Okay, so that brings me to France and Francis, because Francis, the first edict, like there were edicts after edict after edict after edict in France to give the Christians, that a little bit of freedom, the Huguenots.
Yeah.
And his first one was that Edict of Toleration.
Okay, yeah. And I think it was revoked eventually, I think, wasn't it?
It was.
Yeah.
It was.
Yeah.
It was, because that edict didn't work. And when he died and Henry took over, then Henry started with another edict. He brought it because he said that edict is not working, so we got to give them harsher penalties.
That's right.
And then he brought another edict. And I was so surprised to read that with every edict, the Protestant movement grew.
Yes.
So every edict of persecution, the Protestant movement grew, and he could not figure it out.
That's right. Yeah, Tertullian said that the blood of the martyr is the seed of the church, and that's certainly been the testimony of history. Yeah, that's right. And same story in Scotland when the Scottish Presbyterians were being viciously persecuted in the killing times, as it was called. Same thing. The church grew; it became more stalwart in those days.
And to bring that currently to Canada with pastors being thrown in jail, for preaching the gospel when the state says you shouldn't preach the gospel, you should not minister to your flock, and in Alberta recently, the premier said that the premier and the health minister said that this singing is not allowed in New Brunswick. Singing is not allowed in church. You can hum, but you can't sing.
Oh dear. Well, we're not far from it here either. So
even with a mask on, So it's eerily similar.
It is absolutely. Yeah. It is because this kind of treatment of the church doesn't flow from the imaginations of human beings. It flows from the plots of hell. Yes. And so we see common themes again and again because they all have the final same root, inspiring all of that treatment. So we shouldn't be too surprised at that.
Yeah. Oh, Bruce, this is so great. I so appreciate you coming on.
Oh, sure.
And sharing this with us so that we can connect the dots of those stories to our current stories.
Yes, right.
Well,
good. Glad to be of help. See you next time.
I don't know if Renee has any more questions.
I know. I'm gonna pause right there and take it in. That was so great. Thank you.
Okay, thank you.
Well, thank you again, Bruce, and we will talk with you again soon.
Sounds good.
We'll be happy to have you on another time.
All right, very good. Blessings to you.
Good.
Bye-bye.
Well, bye-bye for now.
To learn more about the Christian roots of Canada's history, visit our website at christianrootscanada.org.